The photograph seemed ordinary at first glance. A black soldier standing proudly beside his wife, captured in the warm amber tones of a Harlem photography studio in the winter of 1919. But when Dr. Maya Collins, a senior curator at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, unwrapped the package that arrived on a muggy September morning in 2019, she sensed immediately that this image held something far deeper than a simple homecoming portrait. The bubble wrap fell away to reveal a sepia-toned photograph, its edges softened by decades of careful handling across multiple generations. A black soldier stood erect in a pristine World War I uniform, every button catching the light, every crease razor sharp. Beside him stood a young woman in her finest dress and a wide-brimmed hat decorated with a single delicate flower. A thin gold band on her finger confirmed what their closeness already suggested. The studio stamp on the back read Harlem, New York, February 1919. Maya's breath caught the moment she registered that date. February 1919 was the month the legendary Harlem Hellfighters came marching home from the battlefields of France. The accompanying letter explained how the photograph had surfaced. A real estate developer named Raymond Cole had been overseeing the demolition of an aging brownstone in Harlem when his workers uncovered a military footlocker buried beneath years of debris in the basement. Inside lay medals, handwritten letters, a French-English dictionary filled with margin notes, and this photograph. Raymond had been ready to discard the entire trunk when his elderly grandmother, a lifelong historian and educator who had spent her retirement preserving black heritage, grabbed his arm and insisted he contact the museum immediately. She told me that photograph was carrying a story that had been waiting 100 years to be told, Raymond had written in neat, careful handwriting. She said some truths stay buried until the world is finally ready to receive them. Maya placed the photograph beneath her desk lamp and studied it with practiced intensity. Everything about the soldier's bearing was immaculate. His posture radiated a quiet dignity that seemed to push through the faded paper across a century of silence. The insignia on his uniform confirmed her suspicion. He belonged to the 369th Infantry Regiment, better known to history as the Harlem Hellfighters, the black unit that had fought under French command after the American military refused to let them near the front lines. But it was the soldier's right hand that stopped her cold. Pressed almost invisibly against the dark fabric of his trousers, partially hidden by careful positioning, he held something small and metallic. Something that caught the flash of the photographer's bulb in a way that felt deliberate. Maya reached for her magnifying glass and leaned in close. The object slowly came into focus. A bronze cross suspended from a green and red ribbon. A Croix de Guerre, one of France's highest military honors for battlefield valor. The question burned immediately and with tremendous force. Why would a decorated war hero hide his medal? To understand the answer, you first have to understand what the 369th Infantry Regiment endured to earn that honor. These men had volunteered to fight for a country that denied them the most basic rights of citizenship. They trained at Camp Wadsworth in South Carolina alongside white soldiers who tormented them with slurs and threats. They were barred from marching in New York's farewell parade because, as one white officer declared without shame, black is not a color in the rainbow. When their transport ship finally docked in France in December 1917, the men expected combat assignments. Instead, the American Expeditionary Force handed them shovels and ordered them to unload ships and lay railroad tracks. General John Pershing had no intention of letting black soldiers fight and earn glory. His message was as clear as it was cruel. These men were useful for labor. Nothing more. The French army saw things very differently. Decimated by years of catastrophic losses and desperately short of fighting men, French commanders requested that the 369th be transferred to their command. Pershing agreed without hesitation, glad to be rid of what he privately considered a problem. What happened next astonished everyone who had underestimated these soldiers. The French welcomed them with a respect they had never experienced on American soil. Officers shook their hands without hesitation. They ate at the same tables, trained in the same formations, and were addressed with basic human dignity. For many of these men, it was the first time in their lives they had been treated as equals. Their response was extraordinary. The 369th spent 191 consecutive days in active combat, longer than any other American unit in the entire war. They never surrendered a single trench to the enemy. Not one soldier was captured. They suffered over 1,400 casualties, the highest rate of any American regiment. And when the guns finally fell silent, France awarded the entire regiment the Croix de Guerre, with 171 individual soldiers receiving personal decorations for exceptional bravery. They had done everything their country asked and more. Now they were coming home. 3 weeks of painstaking archival research led Maya to a name. Private First Class Samuel James Crawford. Born 1895 in Albany, Georgia. Enlisted 1917 in New York City. The service photograph matched the man in the portrait without any doubt. The same strong jaw, the same deep-set eyes that seemed to look through the lens into another era entirely. The same small scar above his left eyebrow, explained in his medical file by a clinical notation. Shrapnel wound, left orbital region, Meuse-Argonne offensive, September 1918. Prognosis. Full recovery. Asterisk. Samuel's service record was remarkable. Assigned to Company C of the 369th, he had been commended repeatedly by French officers for extraordinary courage under fire, for his precision as a rifleman, and for the calm steadiness with which he led men around him through circumstances that broke lesser soldiers. On September 29, 1918, during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the bloodiest battle in American military history, Samuel had held a defensive position alone against an advancing German assault while a dozen wounded comrades escaped to safety. For that action, the French government awarded him the Croix de Guerre with Bronze Star in a formal ceremony. His American discharge papers said nothing about any of it. No mention of the French decoration. No acknowledgement of his solo stand at that position. His paperwork listed him as Private First Class, Honorable Discharge, February 1919. A man who had been personally honored by a foreign government for saving a dozen lives was sent home as just another anonymous black soldier without a single distinguished mark on his record. His commanding officer, Captain Louis Monroe, had seen this injustice clearly. Maya found a formal protest Monroe had filed in December 1918, buried in the National Archives for over a century. These men have demonstrated valor beyond question under the worst possible conditions, Monroe had written with evident fury. They deserve recognition identical to their white counterparts, many of whom have accomplished far less. Denying them this honor is a moral catastrophe and a permanent stain upon this nation. Asterisk. The document had been stamped. In red ink. No action required. On February 17, 1919, nearly 3,000 soldiers of the 369th marched up Fifth Avenue through crowds so thick they stretched for miles. Hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers, black and white, lined the route, weeping openly, throwing flowers, screaming themselves hoarse. Lieutenant James Reese Europe's legendary jazz band played music that rattled windows in their frames. The Hell Fighters marched in perfect formation, their French helmets catching the pale winter light, their Croix de Guerre medals visible on their chests. It was a moment of extraordinary pride and devastating irony simultaneously. These men had just spent 191 days fighting for democracy on foreign soil. They were returning to a nation where they could not vote in most states, could not eat in white restaurants, could not ride in the front of a bus or a train, and could not safely walk through certain towns without risking their lives. The parade ended at 145th Street, where Harlem swallowed them in celebration. But Samuel Crawford was already thinking about what came next. A small article in the back pages of the New York Age captured the moment briefly. Private Samuel Crawford of Albany, Georgia, was among those personally decorated by France for exceptional bravery during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Crawford plans to return to Georgia following his discharge to marry his sweetheart, Miss Clara Johnson, who traveled north to witness the historic parade. Asterisk. Maya read the word Georgia and felt something drop in her stomach. Samuel wasn't just going home to the South. He was going back to one of the most dangerous environments on earth for a black man in 1919. Especially a black man who had tasted genuine equality in France. Especially a black man who carried himself with the earned confidence of a decorated combat veteran. Especially a black man who might forget, even for a moment, to make himself invisible. In the Jim Crow South, a black man who walked with his head up was not celebrated. He was perceived as a threat, and she now understood exactly why Samuel Crawford had pressed that medal into his palm and hidden it against his trousers in the photograph. He wasn't hiding it out of shame. He was hiding it to stay alive. The year 1919 has been called the Red Summer by historians, and the name does not come close to capturing the horror. Between April and November, race riots erupted in more than 36 American cities. In Chicago, a black teenager named Eugene Williams drifted past an invisible boundary line while swimming in Lake Michigan on a hot July afternoon and was stoned to death by a white mob while police officers stood on the shore and watched. That murder ignited a week of violence that killed 38 people, injured over 500, and left 1,000 black families homeless after their homes were burned around them. In Washington, white mobs attacked black neighborhoods for 4 consecutive days while law enforcement either stood by or joined in. In Elaine, Arkansas, white vigilantes massacred an estimated 200 black sharecroppers who had dared to organize for fairer wages. The real number may have been far higher, and no one was ever held accountable for any of it. Returning black veterans were targeted with particular savagery. The message was unmistakable and intentional. Men who had fought for democracy abroad would not be permitted to claim it at home. White newspapers ran editorials warning of uppity Negroes, who had been ruined by their time in France, where they had been treated as human beings and had developed what editorialists called dangerous ideas. The Ku Klux Klan, largely dormant for years, experienced an explosive resurgence and eventually swelled to over 4 million members, many of them recruited specifically on the premise that returning black veterans posed an existential threat to white supremacy. In Georgia alone, more than 20 black men were lynched in 1919. Several of them were veterans. Several of them had made the fatal mistake of wearing their uniforms in public. Maya found a confidential NAACP investigators report that described an incident in rural Georgia, dated July 1919. A colored veteran believed to be affiliated with the 369th Infantry Regiment was severely beaten by a mob of approximately 15 men after refusing to remove his military uniform while walking through town. He was hidden in the cellar of a sympathetic white store owner until it was safe for him to leave under cover of darkness. His current whereabouts remain unknown. No name was given, but the location, a rural community approximately 30 miles from Albany, Georgia, made Maya's hands tremble over her keyboard. The official record of Samuel James Crawford ended completely at his February discharge. Whatever had happened to him next existed only in memory, not in any archive she could access. Finding Samuel's descendants required months of quiet persistence. Maya reached out through genealogical networks specializing in African American lineages, through historically black churches in Georgia and New York, through online ancestry communities and retired librarians who had spent careers preserving the records that official history had chosen to ignore. Most paths led nowhere. Polite emails explained that records from this era were fragmentary at best, particularly for black families who had often relocated suddenly and frequently to escape violence, leaving paper trails deliberately thin. Then on a gray Thursday afternoon in late autumn, her phone rang. The woman on the other end identified herself as Eleanor Crawford Washington, 89 years old, a retired schoolteacher living outside Atlanta. Her voice was composed and deliberate, shaped by decades of standing in front of classrooms and making sure children understood that their history mattered. "I believe you've been looking for information about my grandfather," she said, skipping any introduction. "Samuel James Crawford, the soldier who hid his medal." Maya gripped the receiver so tightly her knuckles whitened. "You know about the photograph?" "I know about everything," Eleanor replied, and the weight in those 3 words carried the gravity of a century. She spoke for nearly 2 hours without pause, drawing from a memory sharpened by the discipline of someone who had understood from childhood that forgetting would mean losing something irreplaceable. Samuel had returned to Albany, Georgia, in March 1919. He had married Clara Johnson within the week, in a small ceremony held inside their church because no celebration outdoors would have been safe. He had immediately begun hiding every outward sign of his military service. The uniform was folded and stored in a trunk. The Croix de Guerre was wrapped in cloth and buried at the bottom of that same trunk. He told Clara that the fastest way to get himself killed was to let white men in Albany see him walking around like he thought he deserved respect. He got a job at a sawmill. He kept his eyes down in public. He learned to shrink himself in the presence of white authority, reverting deliberately to behaviors he had spent 2 years in France being freed from. He watched other veterans in the community receive threats for smaller provocations than the ones his record could have provided. The incident the NAACP report described had not been Samuel. It had been a man named Robert Eves, a fellow veteran from a neighboring county. Robert had survived the beating. Barely, and had fled north to Philadelphia within days of being released from the white store owner's cellar. Samuel had heard about it the same week. He never wore anything connected to his service in public again. He used to take the medal out sometimes when we were children, Eleanor said, her voice softening slightly. Just the family, late at night, with the curtains drawn. He would set it on the kitchen table and look at it for a while without saying much. Then he would put it back in the trunk and lock it. One night I asked him why he kept it hidden if it was something France gave him for being brave. He looked at me for a long time before he answered. He said, Eleanor, some countries see a man's courage and reward him for it. Some countries see a man's courage and fear it. I made the mistake of thinking I was coming home to the first kind. I had to learn fast that I was coming home to the second. Samuel Crawford had lived quietly in Albany for another 40 years. He and Clara raised 5 children. He taught Sunday school, coached youth baseball, and became one of the most respected men in his church community. He never publicly discussed his military service. He never contacted the Regimental Association. He never sought any formal recognition from the American government that had erased him from its records. He died in 1961 at age 66. 3 months before he passed, in a hospital bed with Eleanor sitting beside him, he told her that the trunk with the medal was hers to do with as she chose. He said he had spent 40 years trying to decide whether his story deserved to be told, and he had finally concluded that he was not the right person to make that decision. He said, maybe the world changes enough someday that a man like me gets to be a hero without it costing him everything. I won't live to see it. But you might. Eleanor had kept the trunk in her own home for decades. When she could no longer care for it, she passed it to her daughter, who passed it to Raymond Cole, her grandson, the developer who had almost thrown it all away before Eleanor stopped him in that basement in Harlem. Maya spent the following year working with military historians, French government archivists, and a team of legal advocates to formally petition for Samuel Crawford's recognition. In the spring of 2021, the United States Army posthumously upgraded his service record to reflect his Croix de Guerre and his actions during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. A formal ceremony was held in Washington, attended by Eleanor Crawford Washington, who was presented with her grandfather's restored military record and a letter of acknowledgement from the Secretary of the Army. Eleanor accepted both documents with gracious composure, thanked everyone involved, and then asked the assembled officials a single question before she left. How many others are there? How many men like him did this country bury? No one had a satisfying answer. The photograph of Samuel James Crawford now hangs in the National Museum of African American History and Culture, properly labeled, his full story displayed beneath it. His right hand is still visible in the image, pressed against his trousers, the faint outline of the Croix de Guerre barely visible to anyone who does not know to look. A placard beside the photograph reads simply, "He hid it to survive. We display it so he is no longer forgotten." Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe before you go.